Good evening, ladies and gentlemen.
Check that you can hear me at the back. I think this mic's working. It's sensitive to my sound at least. Well, welcome back to our series on planetary health. I'm Sam Bickersteth and I lead the work of the Planetary Health Economic Council, funded by the Rockefeller Foundation but based here at the Oxford Martin School, and this is a seminar that we're doing jointly between our organisations. If you've been here in the previous talks, very nice to see you back. If you haven't seen them, you've got to go online because they've all been brilliant. But we started with the premise that human health, human progress, human well-being and welfare has spectacularly improved in the last 50 years. But that has been at the expense of the systems on which the Earth depends, the natural capital, and the systems that it produces, and the goods and services that nature produces. Much of the growth in human well-being has been drawn from that, and we've shifted capital from one place to another, from nature's capital to human and financial and the built environment in which we live. And that hasn't all been bad. But as we heard just last week, from Georgina Mason and Ian Bateman, that's, we need better ways to capture that value, and much has been done, but at a pretty early stage in integrating that. And as we heard the week before from Miles Allen, who presented the IPCC's special report on 1.5 degrees, we know that we're taking some pretty major risks, and a lot of those impacts are falling heavily on biodiversity, and on water resources, some spectacular impacts in the difference between going to 1.5 degrees and 2 degrees. You will have seen in Miles's talk, and if you haven't seen that, really, we all need to know those alarming figures. But I think the good news is there are organisations out there that are working on this in a pragmatic way. They're not sitting in ivory towers, but they're actually out in the field delivering change and trying to find solutions within the market space in which the global system works, but also working with governments and other organisations. And that's the Nature Conservancy. The TNC is a large organisation that's been practising this for some time. And it's a real pleasure to have Giulio Boccoletti here to talk to this topic of planetary health and drawing on the experience that he's had personally, but the experience of his organisation. Giulio's going to be talking about banking on nature's assets, so this interface between the market and the value of the nature. And okay, I think we can think back to what we heard in a somewhat sort of perhaps more theoretical style about that valuation from Georgina and Ian last week. Giulio is the Chief Strategy Officer of the Nature Conservancy. The Nature Conservancy is very generous in its support to a number of projects here in Oxford University, and the president is also on the council of the Planetary Health Economics Council. So there's lots of connections. So it's a real pleasure to have you here, Giulio. Giulio, I should say, is a multi-talented person. He's done lots of different things. He's actually a climate scientist by background. He's worked in financial markets, and his passion and a lot of his work has been around water resources valuation and the progress that has been achieved on that globally. So, Giulio, over to you. We're very pleased to have you here. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you for coming. It's a pleasure to be here. And thank you for the invitation, the Rockefeller Foundation, the Martin School, and Sam, for your very generous and kind introduction. Let me start here. Let's see if I can work this. So, Lake Tanganyika, it's one of the largest, in fact, the largest and oldest lakes in the world. And it's a good place for us to start talking about what I find at times elusive idea of planetary health. I should warn you, by the way, this is relatively new territory for us as an organization. But it is both fascinating and urgent, and this place in particular has provided us with a really instructive starting point. Before I get to the problem of banking natural assets, which is the topic of our discussion tonight, I wish to just frame the scope of the planetary health conversation at least as we are encountering it in our work. And I should say I don't intend to give a disciplinary definition here tonight for you. I merely want to point out that the boundaries of what constitutes a planetary health concern encompass a very broad, and in fact broadening, set of issues at the intersection of human well-being and the state of the planet's environment. Well, first, we are here. This is the greater Mahalo Ecosystem. It rises from the Lake Tanganyika, and covers about 4.8 million acres of land. At its heart, as you can see in this map, is the Mahale National Park, the Mahale Mountains National Park. Now, from a biodiversity perspective, this is a truly important place. It is home to at least 82 mammal species, and it is the only protected area in the world that hosts both chimp and savanna elephants. In fact, more than 90% of the chimpanzees of Tanzania sit in this particular protected area. It is also a very special place from a freshwater perspective. It is home to more than 250 endemic fish species. This is a rather special ecosystem. A number of these species have evolved here in essentially total isolation for millions of years, maybe up to 10 million years. Right, so this is the story of the environment of this particular place. What about health? Now, if one is to speak about social systems, of course, context matters. In the 60s, I'll tell you this one piece of the story. In the 60s, the villagization of President Nyerere's, it was called the Ujamaa movement, really shaped what we see today. It was an effort to collectivize means of production in the 60s and 70s, and then after that, in the 80s, this national park I was talking about earlier was added. And as a result, the population was pushed from the forest. People like the Twenge people, for example, were pushed from the forest into these villages along the coast. If good planetary health is the presence of an underlying ecological infrastructure that is in some sense right-sized and managed to the needs of the population, and that can sustainably contribute to the well-being of the people that live on it, then this is an emblematic example of what happens when that is not, in fact, available. Demographics has probably been the central symptom of this particular challenge over the last 30 years. Between 1988 and 2002, the number of people in the region doubled to 1.6 million. Now, there was a time when you might have thought that this growth was maybe attributable to incoming refugees, particularly from the DRC, from the Democratic Republic of Congo, and from Burundi. But the fact of the matter is that in 2012, the last census, once most of those refugees had been repatriated, you still had more people. You still had 2.1 million people living in this particular place. So Malthus would have recognized this situation. High fertility rates, close to 8.4 children, high infant mortality rates, extreme poverty. Malthusian trap is essentially set. Of course, endemic malaria, poor water and sanitation conditions, no access to family planning, limited to no clinics, unstocked dispensaries, and a variety of other drivers are in fact the boundary conditions that overdetermine the outcome in this particular place. Now, this is a population with extremely limited natural resources, compared to its size certainly, and yet entirely dependent on its environment for basic livelihood. One of the economic engines of the area is the sardine-like fish called daga. The fish are caught at night and then dried and sold. The fishing is profitable, but it's seasonal. The problem, of course, is that with that many people, the resources are in fact overexploited. As a result, there are very few full-time fishers. Rather, most people are farmers who fish, which means that as the fisheries take the brunt of the pressure and collapse, then, of course, the landscape is immediately behind that. This nexus of resource over-extraction, health insecurity, and poverty results in remarkable unintended consequences. Because malaria is so endemic, in fact, 4 out of 5 of households have someone suffering from the disease at any given time, the needs are very acute. The disease is the principal driver in indebtedness as families try to meet the need for medical support. So it's not surprising that malaria bed nets, for example, would be a good idea under the circumstances. But because of the contextual resource constraint, As soon as the bed nets arrive, rather than being used to protect all family members from malaria, they end up getting used as ring nets to catch fish. And on top of the over-extraction of the sardines, this creates severe ecological problems. These nets are sufficiently tight that they catch also many juvenile pelagic species of that endemic set that I was talking about at the beginning that makes Tanganyika so special. Because they get caught before they can breed, this unintended consequence also accidentally contributes to the collapse of a number of ecologically important stock. Few cases, in my view, give a better sense of what it means for the health of both individuals and societies to depend on flourishing natural systems. It seems to me plainly obvious that you simply cannot imagine solving resource issues in this context without engaging the health community. And vice versa, you cannot hope to effectively address health issues without thinking about resource management. This, in my view, is the archetype planetary health problem. But if these most vulnerable rural communities are obviously dependent in a very real and direct way on the environment, there are many more who are just one major problem away from suffering the exact same problem. For example, my colleague Heather Tallis, whose work has been instrumental in getting us to think about planetary health, has been collaborating with the Center for Global Development and BRAC to try and figure out the following problem. As you might have seen in the news, over the last few months, Cox's Bazar in Bangladesh, this is a picture of that, is now host to over 1 million displaced Rohingya people who have fled Myanmar. In humanitarian emergencies, displaced people rely on their surrounding environment for survival. The environment becomes a source of food, of water, of shelter, of energy, livelihood, as well as a highly politicized space. Because the landscape is so vital to these displaced people, a degraded environment may increase vulnerability in very obvious ways, and typically refugees settle in already marginalized and fragile states. For example, the recent monsoon season, which hit this part of the world, exacerbated environmental challenges for the people in camps. The erosion of soil impacted water resources, making this settlement much more susceptible to disease outbreaks. Fuelwood is the primary source of energy for all Rohingya people in that camp, and it's also the source of energy for 80% of the surrounding host community. So as a result, the forest gets harvested very aggressively. As deforestation advances, fuelwood becomes scarcer to the point that now, it's fair to say it's probably the top reason of tension between refugee and host community. Needless to say, there have been efforts to reforest, mostly to stabilize the slopes in the face of monsoon, but also to try and replenish maybe the fuelwood in the long run. Unfortunately, non-native species have often been used, which has made these plantings highly susceptible to cyclone damage because they in fact maladapted to the type of climate that this place faces. And then in a final tragic irony, human-wildlife conflict is also of concern. The Rohingya happen to have settled in an area that serves as an elephant corridor. Confrontations have killed north of a dozen people since last September as a result of that. Now, if you think this is an interesting but ultimately small problem in the context of a planetary health discussion, you would be quite wrong. Around the world every day, more than 28,000 people are uprooted from their homes, fleeing conflict, violence, persecution, and so forth. Over 65 million people are displaced globally. You can see this here. If you exclude the asylum seekers, you have about 25 million people that are crossing borders, another 40 million that are internally displaced within their own nations. These are people that may well live firsthand the challenge of sustaining planetary health. Forced displacement is not just a big problem in terms of numbers of people, it's also a long-term problem. An average refugee has spent 10 years away from home, and for many this average increases to over 20 years. So the scope of the planetary health question can be expanded to this and can be extended also to natural catastrophes, of course. For example, Kerala in India, you will have seen this between 15th and 20th of August of this year. There's been unusually high rainfall during the monsoon season, which flooded southwestern states in India. The floods killed more than, I think, 350 people and left some 200,000 people homeless. And very quickly, environmental crisis can turn into a public health crisis. Yet, in part, the solution, or rather the prevention of this particular problem, lies in the management of both the river and the ecosystems that surround the infrastructure on it. And even the richest parts of the world are not immune to these types of issues. There are some examples, again, just from this year. Japan, July 3rd to 8th, an extraordinary downpour poured water on the south of Japan, more than on the records of the Meteorological Agency. This was one of the most heavily engineered and managed landscapes on the planet, and yet it was completely overwhelmed. The resulting floods killed about 200 people, and 8 million people were advised to evacuate about 23 prefectures. Al-Shalad, I'm Italian. Just a couple of weeks ago, we lost about 8 million cubic meters of wood in the north of Italy because of massive winds, and then similarly catastrophic downpours. And then, of course, it's in the news, so I should mention it. California, this past 8th of November, the now infamous Camp Fire breaks out. This is in Northern California. The fire cause is unknown at the moment, but it burned through around 100,000 acres of land so far. The death toll went northward of 70 people, and close to 1,000 are still, I think, unaccounted for. There was, in fact, a similar fire, Woolsey fire, happening at the same time in Southern California. These types of catastrophic fires, of course, have impacts on property and lives, but they also have impacts on broader health indicators. As the winds changed and became northerly winds last Thursday, actually, San Francisco ranked worst in the world on air pollution, ahead of Delhi and Lahore. With these examples, I don't want to imply that managing planetary health means achieving a world without catastrophes. That's not the point. But unusual boundary conditions and unexpected fire, or unusual amount of rain, or refugees are mediated by the landscape. It is the interaction of society with those landscapes that ultimately frames, in my view, the planetary health problem. So now that I've given a sense of the types of issues that we are encountering around the world, in which there seems to be value to think about a planetary health framework, let me take a big step back and indeed look at the whole planet for a second before I get to the investment story. Now, we're a science-based organization. We have about 600 scientists on staff, amongst our 4,000 employees. And so we had to ask ourselves the following question. What does it look like if we get this right? What does it look like if we get this right? Is it even possible to reconcile our aspirations of growth and development with the health and nutrition of 9 billion people without losing the ecosystem integrity we depend on in the long run? So a team of scientists, again, led by our Heather Tallis, conducted a study to answer this very question. And if you're interested, it was just now published in Frontiers in Ecology and the Environment. The research was based on a plausible set of assumptions, let's say, about how the world will change between now and 2050. Population growth, 10 billion people, economies grow, millions are presumably lifted out of poverty, and therefore demands for food, water, energy increase accordingly. We then assumed that we would follow a decarbonization scenario consistent with limiting the global mean temperature increase to 1.6 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial temperatures by 2100. That would be, for those who are interested in this, IPCC representative concentration pathway 2.6, RPC 2.6. We then explicitly, and I think that's important, we explicitly modeled what the future could look like if we follow the business as usual path or the sustainability path in meeting these demands. And one of the most important aspects of this study was that we took some pains to do this in a spatially explicit way. We asked the questions of where things would actually happen. If the world changes how and where food and energy are produced, we can then ask the question of what it looks like from a landscape perspective to meet a doubling in food and energy demand while achieving that habitat protection. And in general, the story is rather positive. First, as a conservationist, you might find our sustainability scenario quite appealing. Under that scenario, there is no additional conversion of natural habitat. 500 million hectares more natural habitat is retained compared to business as usual. With the exception of the temperate grasslands biomes, all global biomes remain natural habitat for more than half of their extent in this scenario. Now, temperate grasslands, if you're wondering, unfortunately have already lost almost half of their extent, had already lost it by 2005. And so those we can't save in the same way. So this should be particularly attractive to those who worry about the half Earth, about protecting half of the terrestrial ecosystems. Now, in truth, there are a number of caveats to this picture. other factors, edge effects, fragmentation, endemicity, the impacts of climate change, habitat degradation, will give us very different results on the quality of conservation, but at least there's a start, right? You can actually conserve almost half of the biomes. And from a health perspective, not surprisingly, the sustainability scenario is also quite appealing. This is a picture of air quality in middle income and high income countries. In both scenarios, you end up with relatively better air quality in 2050 because of essentially the adoption of emission control technology. But in the business as usual case, air pollution in multiple African nations, Brazil and India, worsen. And they worsen because of increased fossil fuel use and population growth in those regions. So under this scenario, the BAU scenario, you'd end up in 2050 with about 4.9 billion people with worse air quality than you had in 2010. Instead, under the sustainability scenario, air pollution exposure would be massively reduced. You'd end up with about 700 million people. That's a lot of people, but it's significantly less than you'd have in the BAU scenario. 700 million people expected to live in areas with lower air quality. Now, I don't want to be Pollyannish about any of this. The paper is not some secret map about how all of this can happen, so don't look for that. But it does show that there is no biophysical reason why we could not do this sustainably. In other words, the biophysical limits of a finite planet by themselves are not a constraint on more sustainable development, on meeting the aspirations of growth and the aspirations of sustainability. These are not, in fact, internally inconsistent. Obviously, achieving something resembling the sustainability scenario would be incredibly ambitious. Now, I've described the broad boundaries of what the planetary health space looks like from where I'm sitting, and this you can think of as our North Star, in a sense. What are we aiming for? What's the world that we're trying to achieve? So now's the time to actually honor the title of this talk and talk a bit about finance and natural assets and where they fit in this picture. But to do that, I have to actually tell you a little bit about the Nature Conservancy. So, the Nature Conservancy, through its history, has achieved results mostly through innovative transaction-based structures. It was fishing, quota acquisitions, it was debt restructuring, new market tax credits, and others. And all of these done typically with the local communities. We started with land acquisition, and in those, of course, financing was a central protection strategy for us. This example here, I have a picture from 1955, is when we did our first ever deal. This was a 60-acre purchase along the Manus River Gorge, which is on the border of New York and Connecticut. The Conservancy provided about $7,500 US at the time, was a fairly significant amount of money, to finance the purchase, with the provision that the loan be repaid so that it could be used in other conservation efforts later on. That first deal helped us set up a revolving loan fund, which became what we call the Land Preservation Fund, which is still one of the organization's principal conservation tools. Over the subsequent 60 years, TNC protected over 110 million acres of land this way. That's more than the size of France, if you're sort of looking for orientation. But we now have expanded significantly across 70 countries and working on both terrestrial, freshwater, and marine ecosystems, and with a variety of tools. The point is that we strive to do big deals that make a difference to the problems that we're trying to solve. And for that, we need to get creative with the mechanics of those deals, the way in which they actually happen. And the scale inevitably needs to be substantial, and often they are. I'll give you just a couple of examples to set the expectations in your mind about what kind of solutions and what kind of scale we might be talking about here when we talk about planetary health interventions. So this beautiful place is the Great Bear Forest. In the mid-2000s, we were invited by local communities to join the efforts to save the Great Bear Forest, which is along the west coast of Canada. We helped establish a $120 million coast fund divided between essentially environmental conservation, and then was a sinking fund for investments in economic development. The coast funds linked sustainable development, community well-being of the First Nations, and the permanent conservation of the Great Bear rainforest ecosystem. On February the 1st, 2016, happily, the final Great Bear Rainforest Agreement was signed between the First Nations and the British Columbia government, which permanently conserves 19 million acres of Pacific coast between Vancouver Island and the southeast Alaska. And about 9 million acres of those are completely off limits from logging, with the balance managed under some of the world's most stringent harvest standards. Another example, just to, again, give you a sense of scale, 2014, we set up what we call the Great Western Checkerboard Project to help conserve the ecological integrity of 166,000 acres of forests, rivers, wildlife habitat in the Eastern Cascade Mountains of Washington, and then in the Blackfoot River Valley in Montana. The Conservancy used interim financing to acquire the lands from a timber company, and this was about $130 million worth of acquisition. And this project stitches together important migratory corridors in both Montana and Washington that then link up to Canada. These places are among the largest and most ecologically important tracts of private land in the crown of the continent. That's what the area is called. And the project is a hub for grizzly bear, for lynx, for wolves, whose survival depends on having enough space to roam and move along. And the checkerboard's name is obviously comes from the structure of the land distribution, which is the result of the private development of those lands about 100 and 150 years ago. Or in 2016, last example I'll give you, in the Seychelles completed a debt for nature conversion with the Nature Conservancy. The deal raised funds to buy Seychelles sovereign debt, which was at the time held by European countries, mostly the UK and France, to refinance it under more favorable terms. In return, a portion of repayments will be redirected to fund climate change adaptation, sustainable fisheries, and marine conservation. The financing promoted the implementation of a marine spatial plan for the entire Seychelles exclusive economic zone, which is the thing included in that black line on the map. This is a territory, or rather a seascape that's 3,000 times the landmass of the Seychelles. It amounts to about 400,000 kilometers squared. That's 99 million acres. So it's bigger than the size of Germany. My point with all of these examples, and I hope you'll hear this, is that it is not inconceivable to achieve big landscape scale successes, and often these can be achieved through the careful use of finance and financial engineering. These examples, therefore, should give us some hope that one could aspire to put a tangible dent into the planetary health issues I was describing at the very beginning of this discussion. However, when it comes to planetary health issues, the problem is not so much the financial engineering. What is proving difficult is to convince society, all of us, to value our own health and recognize how the environment, defined as the landscape we inhabit, is a functionally effective part of our security infrastructure. How the environment is a functionally effective part of our security infrastructure. The skeptics amongst you, presumably Oxford, there may be a lot of you in the room, you might be forgiven to thinking that if this were so plainly obvious, it was so obvious that investing in nature is such a deterministic way of improving the human condition, why would we have needed the last several decades of efforts from Rio onwards to try and mobilize the broader polity around it? After all, isn't environmental condition, the state of the environment, an externality, a cost to some, a benefit to others? But in either case, whether it's a cost or benefit, isn't it just an unpriced byproduct of some other intervention someone is paying for? If that is the case, if indeed environmental condition, the condition of the environment, is simply a byproduct of the consumption or production of goods and services, then we ought to be having a conversation about regulatory intervention, about pricing that externality. And indeed, don't get me wrong, a lot of environmental work, maybe most of it, is fundamentally about that problem. And it certainly is one way to think about integrating the world of human development and health and environmental management. But the fact of the matter is that while we strive to do that, there are a number of institutional and practical reasons which we live every day why organizing action around tangible, credible cash flows that might exist today makes a whole lot of difference to achieving real impact at scale. Let me be clear, I hope you'll hear this as well. Not all value is expressed in terms of what can be exchanged for money. That's not what I'm saying. Just like we don't necessarily pay through tariffs the full value to us of having a functioning sewer system. Consumer surplus far exceeds what is captured by the transactions. But the question remains of whether the value that is available in exchange is sufficient to achieve the outcome we're seeking and support its financing. Where does the source of value for conservation and for improving the condition of nature come from? If we answer that question, if we can identify sources of value in exchange that exist today, which can pay for environmental outcomes that have a public health implication, then you have the premise for an investment and possibly the basis for the definition of an asset in a financial sense. So if we leave aside the question, which is an important question, of reframing value from what it is to what we'd like it to be, and we stick to what is available now, it turns out there are still a number of opportunities to mobilize resources to achieve multiple objectives that are consistent with the planetary health framing. And I hope the rest of my talk will be about hopefully demonstrating some of these early examples. Now, one option, maybe the most obvious, is if an appropriately managed natural asset becomes a substitute of some other existing solution to deliver public health outcomes that someone is in fact already paying for. That is, if you can invest in nature instead of some other technical solution, right? In that world, the source of value already exists. Whatever society was going to pay for solution A can be better achieved with solution B, right? That is not the only option, by the way, but I will focus on that for the rest of my remarks. One of the obvious places to start is, in fact, the water sector. Water utilities are, first and foremost, public health interventions. And we pay for them today directly through tariffs and indirectly through taxes. A lot of money, actually. Worldwide, average expenditures in the water sector are around $500 billion a year. That's both capital and operating expenditures. But utilities are also man-made systems of landscape intermediation. They are natural monopolies in which we, as a society, decide how to occupy and modify the landscape to achieve a public good. The full public and common value of a utility is hardly reflected in the marginal tariffs and taxation that are used to operate them. But nevertheless, unless they are perpetually bankrupt, which can happen, in fact, they represent a tangible value pool that can pay for a very specific service and therefore support investment. It is worth pointing out, by the way, that when we talk about paying for water, we're not actually paying water, the resource. What we're paying for through the utility is water security, the social outcome. And we know that there is, in fact, some degree of substitution possible in water today. This is a map of New York City, the water utility of New York, which probably represents the most famous example of this. And some of you, many of you maybe will have heard about this before. New York draws its waters from a protected set of reservoirs upstate in the Catskills and Delaware. It gravity feeds these water resources into the city with relatively limited filtration because of the purity of the water. The environmental regulator grants the DEP, the Department of Environmental Protection, which operates the utility and is also the asset owner, what's called a filtration avoidance determination, which means that the protection of the landscape is sufficient to meet the statutory responsibilities of the utility towards the public. This is granted in exchange for a commitment to a continued program of land acquisition and management to limit human activities in the watershed, okay? The substitution is often advertised. If New York did not have that system of protected reservoirs, it would have to build a $10 billion treatment works, a massive capital expenditure for the city. And note this, it is in fact a bankable natural asset, because the asset in question is in fact land ownership. The DP buys the land at a fair market price through a fund the city has instituted, which is in effect in the capital accounts of the city, and that is in turn financed through the municipal bond market. So effectively, this is in fact an existing natural asset underwritten by a senior obligation. Now, for those of you who follow the water sector, this is not hugely dissimilar from having the watershed activities of the UK PLCs here, the water utilities, being included in the pricing review of the economic regulator Ofwat. Now, if you know this example, you might counter, well, there are many things that are unusual about the New York setup. First, it is one of the largest metropolitan areas in the world, which happens to be served by this forested space. The tax base of a city of this kind and the wealth of a city of this kind gives it, in fact, a lot of options. Think about this, the acquisition program of the DP for land is on the order of a few $100 million. Their annual capital budget for capital expenditures is on the order of $1 to $2 billion per year. Second, there is a bit of an accident of history in how this particular setup happened. the relationship between the rural community in the Catskills and the city was fraught for much of the 20th century as the wealthy urban center went in and bought up land and waters in the rural areas. And this, of course, constrained the development of the rural community. This was resolved in the mid-90s with what's called a Watershed Memorandum of Agreement, which bound the city, the state, and the local watershed communities into a plan for the future. But it's a kind of complicated, path-dependent arc that takes us to this particular solution. And then third, this is actually not exactly a conservation effort in a strict biological sense. In many ways, this is a landscaped environment more than a planetary health intervention. It certainly looks very beautiful, and it is in fact functional in many ways, certainly in terms of the ecosystem services it provides. But these are, in fact, artificial reservoirs, so the primary environmental intervention is simply the absence of development around them. Yeah? Nevertheless, the example of New York has inspired the idea that maybe, just maybe, the water sector could be a vehicle through which this idea of planetary health could be turned into investable, bankable projects within an existing economic and financial framework, which is that of the water utilities. Right, so we're making some progress on that idea. Let me tell you a story from New Mexico. There is a large ecosystem that runs along most of the Rocky Mountains, from New Mexico and Arizona to Colorado, and up into Montana and British Columbia. It is the large ponderosa pine forest of the Rocky Mountains. The ponderosa pine, the Pinus ponderosa, is a native species in the US and Canada. It's one of the most common in America. The forest management practices that have been dominant here have resulted in a highly dense forest, mostly because of encouraged suppression and prevention. There's the idea of increasing forest reserves and for safety. But it is extremely and unnaturally dense, and it's also very dry. Since the 90s, New Mexico has suffered a significant increase in temperature, about 2 degrees on average, in some years up to 4 degrees compared to average. So by 2005, this forest had largely dried out, and what was once a very robust source of timber, it essentially turned into a very robust source of fuel for the next fire. Now, there are two very significant cities in the story. That's the watershed of the Rio Grande, and there's Santa Fe, which is at the top there, just under 100,000 people, and Albuquerque, which has about 500,000 people. Then, on the 26th of June 2011, at about 1 p.m. local time, at a place called Las Conchas, which is near Los Alamos, a tree fell on a power line. It almost immediately ignited a severe wildfire, and because of the winds, the fire began to spread at a rate of an acre per second. An acre per second. Within the first day, it had burned 43,000 acres. Within a week, it had burned 150,000 acres. Because of the density of the fuel wood, the temperature, this is the actual fire, was extremely hot. In some areas, the fire was so hot that the soil vaporized. Okay? This wildfire became known as Las Conchas wildfire. The largest wildfire that New Mexico ever had to that date. Would have been extraordinary, except that the following year, the Whitewater Baldy Complex fire ended up having the dubious privilege of taking that title, having destroyed 250,000 acres of land in the south of New Mexico. But back to Las Conchas, this is what was left behind, only ash. But that was not the end of the story, because about 6 weeks later, starting on August 21st, two pretty normal storms happened. Rain comes down, and it starts dragging down what you see in this video, which is the debris and the ash that had been left behind by the wildfire and makes it into the Rio Grande. This is at the beginning, actually. A few minutes later, you'll see it getting worse. It got so bad at one point that a 2-story building got covered by this event. In the end, let me see if I can get a view here. In the end, we ended up with this, which is a 21 meter deep sediment plug in one of the Rio Grande tributaries. And of course, this disaster was not just a forestry disaster. Downstream from the site of the fire, there was one of the principal reservoirs of the water system of New Mexico. So that's what it looked like. And at this point, and that's where it was situated. So it's important for you to see where this problem happened. Right? So just look at the map on the left there. Water from New Mexico City's Santa Fe and Albuquerque down there comes from Colorado down the Rio Grande, which is that line there. Then Santa Fe pipes water from the river to the city. Up at the very northwest of the state, up at the very top there, is the San Juan Chama Water Project, which channels additional water through to the Chama River and down in a tributary of the Rio Grande, and then all the way down to Albuquerque. So you can see what happened. This fire did not just happen anywhere. It happened right at the heart of the utility system of the state. And the utility system here is not simply the infrastructure that was built in proximity of the cities. It is the integrated system that comprises both the built infrastructure and the function of the watershed. And of course, the result shows up in the public sphere, because this is what comes out of your tap in Albuquerque if that happens. The treatment works of Albuquerque were overwhelmed, and for 40 days, this is the quality of the water that came out of that system. Under these conditions, the flooding event was declared a federal disaster. So this is another good example of how conservation can become a substitute for extremely expensive interventions downstream. And in this case, it is in fact an ecological restoration. Our chapter locally, the New Mexico chapter, has been working on this. We know where to target. We want to restore the forest to look like this. And we also know that this work represents a positive return on investment. For example, we examined 2 scenarios impacting Tahoe County in New Mexico, and we found that in both, the cost of doing the treatment is actually far lower than the actual benefit that comes from having it done in case of wildfires. So this is a case of investment in principle. The challenge is then how do you turn this insight into it's essentially operational work into the landscape, into something that's investable, that's an investable proposition. And there are a number of complex challenges here. Probably the most important is the land ownership structure. Consider just the land distribution. Here's a map of the land ownership structure in the Rio Grande. It requires working with dozens of partners. We actually have more than 50 partners here, from federal entities, counties, cities, districts, and so forth, so on. Unlike the case of the DP, by the way, I should point out Albuquerque cannot afford to buy itself the Rio Grande, right? And so there's a question of how do you actually set yourself up? And this is where we developed the idea of a water fund, which is essentially a vehicle to finance and govern the problem of connecting the downstream beneficiaries to the upstream providers of water in the watershed. They are a governance mechanism. They act as a secretariat for planning and prioritizing interventions in the watershed. They are a funding vehicle where downstream users can pay for upstream protection. And finally, they drive a watershed conservation program on the ground. Now, I don't have a lot of time to tell you a lot more about the details of this today, but we are trying to figure out how to then capitalize and make these happen at scale. And incidentally, one of the places this might work sooner than we expected is Cape Town. Because you might have heard that Cape Town ran against this day zero problem, and the city was forced to tap the water. This is the result of severe underinvestment in infrastructure and a severe drought. Well, it turns out that invasive species in the watershed drink about 2 months of water per year in Cape Town. And so this is an obvious way in which we could solve some of these problems. We have more than 35 such water funds across 12 countries in various stages of implementation. And we are, in fact, quite confident that the opportunity for payments is around $48 to $50 billion a year in payments for ecosystem services. And so the question, and by the way, already 24 of those billion are being paid, although they're mostly national programs and direct transfers rather than payments for investment. If that expenditure were financed as part of a utility capital program, it would represent about 7 or 8% of the total worldwide expenditure for water, which is actually comparable to what the City of New York spends on its Catskills watershed. So because Sam is looking at me very earnestly, I'll speed up some of the things I was going to say here. But let me say just a couple of other things. One, you might be thinking, gosh, this guy sounds like he's very interested in utilities. The fact of the matter is that if you map out the targets of the Convention on Biological Diversity, and you say, where do those targets overlap with these watersheds that we could protect for the purposes of providing clean water? Well, it turns out that an additional 44 countries could meet their CBD 2020 targets if they protected these watersheds that happen to also then protect their source water. So this is a very material way of achieving both health outcomes as well as environmental outcomes. Just to whet your appetite, we're not doing this only with utilities and water provision. We're doing this as stormwater. I don't have time to talk to you about this today, but we are investing in similar ideas where you have effects of substitution, where nature is the option B that gives you a better answer for the same solution as option A. We are starting to look at this in air pollution. We have a control trial running right now in Louisville, Kentucky, which is what this picture is about, trying to plant trees and detect the impact on the health of 700 participants in a 3-year-long survey to try and understand whether creating an ecosystem in a city could actually be a substitute from some downstream health interventions that are required. And then lastly, another example, if you're interested in this, come to speak to me, is the application of this for protection along coasts. We're doing the same. This is in Mexico, in Cancun. Turns out the Mesoamerican reef is actually very effective at protecting parts of the coastline from typhoons. So we've created a financing mechanism with an insurance policy with Swiss Re to try and optimize the deployment of capital against that. Okay, with this massive acceleration in mind, let me conclude, happily. I don't want to leave you with the impression that I'm sitting here telling you that everything will be solved by capital markets and the private sector. It won't, and I'm not. Even if we're able to mobilize private capital at scale, as we've unfortunately seen over the last few years, private debt is often public debt in waiting, particularly if it is a contingent liability. Hidden in the assets that are susceptible to investment from the private sector are assumptions about future value creation, which may not come to fruition. And there's always going to be some underlying public choice about the landscape. And that is ultimately what the government and taxpayer tend to be on the hook for in the end. All these activities have an underwriter of last resort in the public, because all these things happen somewhere and we're making policy choices about where they happen. And a key unanswered question, one that may be interesting from a research perspective, is what is the actual underwriting capacity of the public sector that needs to be mobilized to make some of these things happen. But I hope I've convinced you that there are in fact mechanisms available today to get going in some degree of scale on this question of planetary health. So I'll take you in closing back to Tanganyika. This is the village of Mahalo. The Nature Conservancy here worked with Pathfinder International to develop integrated projects that attempt to simultaneously address population, health, and environmental issues. The project actually is named Tuungane, which means let's unite in Kiswahili. And it's actually been quite extraordinary. We've recruited trainers, classic extension service trainers, 100 volunteers who, however, now are not just trained in community health, family planning, sanitation, and so forth, but also in the benefits of crop rotation, importance of trees, sustainable fishing, and so forth. We've integrated all of these in, as usually happens in household level. We've recruited about 10% of the households as model households. And these people integrate not just good hygiene practices and family planning as in a traditional health intervention, but also sustainable resource use. And the results have been quite encouraging. On top of the health outcomes, 17,000 people have had access to family planning since we started. The total fertility rate has dropped from 8.4 to 7. We've also had impact on the resources. We've had beach management units that were able to enforce bans on those mosquito nets. And that has reduced dramatically the impact. Now, the banning of the fishing, of course, then means that people transition to the landscape. And you might expect then, oh my God, it's going to be a disaster for the landscape. But as it turns out, whilst median landholding increased from 3 to 4 acres roughly, only 2% came from clearing bush or forest land. And that's because we've used all the interventions like village land use planning, land reserves, deployment of village forest scouts and so forth, so on, to really sensitize people to the management of the natural resource. And it worked. We did a census of chimpanzees in the protected area, which is one of the key wildlife-human competition. And it turns out the numbers are stable. And in a recent survey, people in the village said that the forests were now better protected and regulated. So, the Nature Conservancy inhabits a world of praxis, of practical problems. We have people trying to get work done in the world. And while I hope these examples have given you tonight some sense of the reason why you think there's some good opportunities for nature to be part of a long-term approach to health, much remains to be figured out. A lot of the questions that come out of this are vastly under-theorized and will require smart people in universities to think about. But I think there are some reasons to be remain cautiously optimistic about the potential to converge into planetary health agenda, against which we might be able to mobilize significant capital at scale, hopefully to make a difference to people and nature. Thank you very much.
Julia, have a seat. That was fantastic. Wonderful photographs as well, but incredible scope in your talk. And I'm sure you've all got many questions. And I suppose I want us to be relatively optimistic, because that's where you started. So there may be some queries and some clarifications, but I hope people can take your tenor of can-do optimism, which you nicely end with. We could just go to the pub, but if you want to stay for a bit, we can have 15 minutes of questions. So, are there any questions? Oh, Julia. Got one here. So, Tom, you're going to get the microphone first. As we're live streaming this, it's helpful for you to use the microphone and say who you are, please.
So, Tom Pinkowski, DPhil student in the Department of Zoology. So, as you've kind of highlighted in your talk, thank you for the talk, it was very interesting. As you've highlighted in the talk, many of these links between ecosystems and human health are local and context-specific. Planetary Health is interested in, transboundary and international issues. How scalable are these solutions?
It's a great question. Well, let me speak about the one I spoke most, which is the water fund example, the use of ecosystem services to solve a water security problem whilst protecting an environmental asset. And those, we believe, are actually quite scalable, in part because it's interesting, the setup mostly depends on the relationship within the city and the watershed. And that's more similar across nations than nations are similar to each other. And so it turns out that if you organize an intervention around the sort of power, the centralizing power of a city, then you can actually scale quite a bit. Now, we've scaled in the sense that we've replicated some 30 plus times, which is significant, but still tiny compared to what we're trying to do. We think that there are about 1,000 cities around the world, above 100,000 people, that could protect their watershed in some appropriate sense and come out financially better. And so that the protection of the watershed is a cost-effective way of delivering water security. It's 1,000 people, it's 600 million people worldwide. And so, if we achieve that, it will be scalable. But as ever in conservation, I'll let you know when we get there. The only proof is having done it.
I'm just going to push you a little bit more while you think of your question. Any of those 1,000 cities going to involve negotiations across national territories, so sovereign borders? Because I think that's more challenging than within.
It is. Some will. I'm a big fan of starting where you can. So, I think that you shouldn't discount the fact that you can get to a lot of these places without worrying about transnational issues. Obviously, water funds on the Indus will be a significantly more complicated thing to pull off than water fund on the Rio Grande. That said, I think they build on a tradition in transboundary negotiations, which is that the practice is far more advanced than the theory. It turns out that one would expect theoretically to see all sorts of things that actually then in practice don't happen, and people do find common ground. The whole purpose of these types of water funds are creating a table for negotiation based on facts, giving people the same set of kind of factual information. So I think, we haven't done a transboundary one, let's put it that way, but I'm optimistic.
Thank you, yes.
Hi there, Rebecca Peters with the School of Geography and Environment. I've had the good fortune to work with the Nature Conservancy as a contractor, so I've seen some of the projects from a smaller scale, but it'd be interesting to hear more about how the Nature Conservancy approaches its role as a leader, and particularly how it builds coalitions with unwilling actors.
Yeah, with great difficulty, I would say. Well, I think, one of the core competencies of the organization, or one of the competencies that we invest in the most, is the stakeholder engagement, right? Because all of these, as you saw in the example of New Mexico, this is true across the world, are when you're trying to kind of solve extensive problems that are spatial, you end up with negotiations across many, many people, interests, very, very rarely a full subsidiarity principle operates, so you have multiple actors at multiple levels. And so you have to kind of develop a skill. We tend to think that, science is helpful because it has an institutional value that transcends most nations. And so, bringing science to the table, mapping, and by science I mean evidence. I mean, it's not just the scientific process, but it's trustworthy evidence is an important, maybe critical component to bring people to the table. The other thing is that I think it is a negotiation, so you have to go into these things understanding everybody's interests. And our experience in the United States and across the world is that we indeed do work across the political spectrum, across the interest spectrum, and we succeed when we bring science to bear.
Okay, now Hannah's at the back of the room holding a microphone. There must be some questions there. Someone over here.
Hi, I'm Jill Shankelman. I'm a local resident. Just sort of trying to understand your approach, because it involves a sort of mind shift. So thinking about somewhere like Oxford, part of the Thames Valley. So we have one water utility, bills constantly rising for users. The company has incredible problems getting any agreement to build new reservoirs. We have a crumbling infrastructure, sort of full of leaks. How do you start thinking about approaching a system like that from a quite different perspective you're suggesting?
It's a great question, and I do think actually the UK, well, England and Wales in particular, are a incredibly valuable laboratory because leave aside any judgment about the privatization and the fact that we had PLCs to start with. It so happens that then it's quite transparent because they have to, all their capital programs have to be reviewed by the same economic regulator. And so, in fact, I think the Environment Agency also believes that there is, in fact, quite a lot of opportunity in sort of natural infrastructure. Now, the devil's in the details because what is natural here is an interesting question. And I would submit that all companies in the UK are, in fact, already spending quite a bit of money in their operating budget for Environment Agency-approved activities in the watershed. I assume, I'll say this as an opinion, I don't know it for a fact, but I suspect it's not optimized. They don't treat those expenditures as capitalized expenditures. They are an operating expenditure. They're a cost, a tax that they have to spend. What I'd like to do is to see natural infrastructure be built into the regulated asset base. So instead, on their cost curve of capital expenditures, before the Abingdon Reservoir, there should be some other pieces of infrastructure that are green, grow, and you can do other things on.
So I've got a couple of questions at the front. Let's take both these. This gentleman here and then Andrew.
Hi, my name is Alex. I'm also in zoology. I work in the Nature-Based Solutions Initiative. I was wondering if you could shed some light on these water funds and their operationalization, specifically how exposed they are to international markets.
That's a nice one. Andrew, why don't we take your question to keep things going?
Yeah, under the title banking, I thought you were going to talk quite a bit about finance or financial firms. And the finance industry is very interested in this, but it tends to show up through insurance, and you did kind of mention insurance. What's your kind of views on the idea of using insurance as a instrument, not just to insure, but to discipline people and get people to do investments, because it pulls the insurance premiums down on them. There's a whole sort of set of models you mentioned.
Yeah.
Just your views, whether you think that's a panacea or overhyped or whatever. Thank you.
Right. So on the internationalization, the ceiling for exposure to international markets is the exposure to international markets of the water sector, which is not very high. So if you think of this as a solution adopted in the water sector is not a hugely globalized sector to start with. And so it's, in some sense, relatively low. That said, if you're buying yourself a treatment works, you're going to speak to a number of known suppliers, most likely. And so I think that there's an argument to say that in a perfect world, this would be one of the things that you might be able to buy. Now, the question is, what is it that you're buying? What you're buying is a plan for a watershed, a process of stakeholder engagement. You're buying a security of a contract between different payers. And so that's what we need to kind of, in a way, productize, right? So that's what we're trying to do, is create enough track record on these water funds so that people start recognizing them everywhere in the world. So we're at the beginning of that journey, but that's what we're trying to do, and we're trying to collaborate with utilities like Veolia and others who have an international reach to try and make this happen elsewhere. In terms of the financial sector, I mean, insurance specifically, as certainly not a panacea. We are working with insurers. We're working with reinsurers, like Swiss Re, as I said. And there are some cases, particularly when you're dealing with these contingent liabilities, like a cyclone happening, where there is a lot of inefficiency in where the risk is apportioned, and the insurance product can improve that. I'll make a broader point, which I care a lot about. Sometimes people think, oh, this all finance stuff is, are you selling out nature? The fact of the matter is that finance, aside from the question of who owns what, finance as a discipline has proven to be an incredibly valuable instrument for us, because it asks very hard questions about where returns come from, what exactly is it that you're trying to do, how much does it cost, and it's not everything is susceptible to the type of analysis. Certainly R&D isn't, but because we're trying to scale, it's a very useful frame of analysis, because it helps us be very disciplined about what it would take to get to scale in the current economic systems.
So as an audience, you've been really nice to Julia about this, and you sort of answered the question about the financialization of nature, but I think you're from Side Business School, aren't you? So you're going to be on the side of the financiers.
Oh, not at all. I'm still an academic, sorry. Yes, I love the idea of, thinking of the investment as a capitalized expenditure, which can then go on a balance sheet. The puzzle that we are tackling with is on whose balance sheet can it become an asset? I mean, sure, we can interpret it as a project level boundary and therefore collectively owned. I mean, it gets hazy at that stage for us.
Yeah. So, like everything in the landscape, you end up, the money goes into a bunch of operations and an illiquid asset, and so it's not very creditworthy. And so, where this is starting to work is where one of the actors in the water fund is, in fact, a creditworthy counterpart. And so often the utility, in the perfect world, the utilities would just do this, right? I mean, and then you wouldn't need special purpose vehicles off the balance sheet of the utility. Trouble is, most utilities in the world are a department of a municipality. They're not actually a corporatized entity. And so this question, the capital accounts and the operating accounts don't work together. And in that world, it's harder to make the case, because you have to spend money to buy a piece of land, and taking a picture in front of a beautiful landscape is not the same thing as taking a picture in front of a dam if you're a politician. And so there's reasons why you then have to go to a second best option, which is, can we regulate by contract? Can we set up a vehicle that is able to receive funds and then expend them? And in our experience, so far, even just that, even having a current account, requires a creditworthy counterpart, and certainly when we go to financing it, it will.
So in layman's language, a privatized utility is better able to adopt this model, or not necessarily?
A corporatized utility, whether it's private or public, it doesn't matter. But what I'm saying is it needs to use the discipline of modern financial management.
That's helpful, yeah. I think we're nearly there, unless there are any other questions. Anything else people want to ask? Well, Julia, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks
really
for coming.
Excellent. Before we thank you, I'd like to just advertise one more Planetary Health talk this term here on food systems. So we're moving from water to food this time next week, so do come back if you can. If you can't, we'll continue to have the occasional event on Planetary Health running through the term into the new year. But thank you very much indeed, Julia. That's been marvellous and lots to take home to think about. Thank you.